self-similarity, sex and ethnicity. Automatically and unconsciously, people also use cues of self-similarity, like sex and ethnicity, to further hone and personalize their cultural learning. Self-similarity cues help learners acquire the skills, practices, beliefs, and motivations that are, or were in our evolutionary past, most likely to be suitable to them, their talents, or their probable roles later in life. For example, many anthropologists argue that the division of labor between males and females is hundreds of thousands of years old in our species lineage. If true, we should expect males to preferentially hang around, attend to, and learn from other males, and vice versa for females. This will result in novices learning the skills and expectations required for their likely roles later in life, as mothers, hunters, cooks, and weavers. Similarly, since individual differences, like height or personality, might influence one's success in various endeavors, learners may preferentially attend to those whom they resemble along these dimensions. In Chapter 11, I will further detail the evolutionary logic underpinning the prediction that learners should preferentially attend to and learn from those who share their ethnic group markers, such as language, dialect, beliefs, and food preferences. In short, these cues allow learners to focus on those most likely to possess the social norms, symbols, and practices that the learners will need over their life course for successful and coordinated social interactions. There is ample evidence from psychological experiments, going back 40 years, that both children and adults preferentially interact with and learn from same-sex models over opposite-sex models. In young children, these biases emerge even before they develop a gender identity and influence their learning from parents, teachers, peers, strangers, and celebrities. In fact, children learn their sex roles because they copy same-sex models, not vice versa. Evidence indicates that this learning bias influences diverse cultural domains, including musical tastes, aggression, postures, and object preferences. Later, we'll see that in the real world, it influences both students' learning and performance, as well as patterns of copycat suicide. Recent work by the brain scientist Elizabeth Reynolds Lowson, a former student of mine, and her colleagues at UCLA, has begun to illuminate the neurological underpinnings of sex-biased cultural learning. Using fMRI technology, Liz focused on the difference between people's brains when they imitated a same-sex model versus an opposite-sex model. She asked both men and women in Los Angeles to first watch and then imitate the arbitrary hand gestures either of a same-sex or opposite-sex model. By comparing the same individual's brain activity while watching versus watching and imitating both same and opposite-sex models, Liz showed that women find mimicking other women more rewarding, neurologically speaking, than mimicking men. Men showed the opposite pattern. When people copied same-sex models, firing activity was higher in the nucleus accumbens, dorsal and ventral striatum, orbital frontal cortex, and left amygdala. Her analysis of the existing database of brain studies reveals that this pattern of brain activity emerges when people receive a reward, such as money, for getting the correct answer. This finding suggests that we experience copying same-sex others as internally more rewarding than copying opposite-sex others. We like it more, so naturally we are inclined to do it more. While research on ethnicity biases in cultural learning are more limited, it's increasingly clear that infants, young children, and adults preferentially learn from co-ethnics, meaning that people attend to and selectively learn from those who share their ethnic markers. Young children preferentially acquire both food preferences and learn the functions of novel objects from those who share their language or dialect. This is true even when the potential models speak Jabberwocky, English-sounding speech composed of nonsense words. That is, kids prefer to learn from those speaking nonsense in their own dialect, rather than from someone speaking nonsense in a different dialect. Suddenly, I'm reminded of much American political discourse. Infants preferentially copy the unusual and more difficult action, turning on a lamp with their head, of someone who speaks their language, German, as opposed to an unfamiliar language, Russian. And children and adults prefer to learn from those who already share some of their beliefs. These laboratory findings suggest that cues related to sex and ethnicity fire up our cultural learning psychology in ways that spark our interest in what the model is doing or talking about and focus our attention and memory. If true, students may learn more effectively from teachers or professors who match them on these dimensions, which may impact a person's grades, choice of major, or career preferences. Formal education is, after all, primarily an institution for intensive cultural transmission. Of course, identifying this learning bias as a casual influence is tricky in the real world because teachers have biases too, which may lead them to preferentially assist or reward those who share their sex or ethnic markers. Isolating causality in the real world is what economists are best at, so let's bring in some economists. By exploiting large data sets of students, courses, and instructors, my UBC colleague Florian Hoffman and his collaborators unearthed real-world evidence consistent with the experimental findings discussed earlier. Being taught by instructors whom you match on ethnicity or race reduces your dropout rate and raises your grades. In fact, for African American students at a community college, being taught by an African American instructor reduced class dropout rates by 6 percentage points and increased the fraction attaining a B or better by 13 percentage points. Similarly, using data from freshmen, first years, at the University of Toronto, Florian's team has also shown that getting assigned to a same-sex instructor increased students' grades a bit. Unlike many researchers before them, Florian and his colleagues addressed concerns that these patterns are created by the instructor's biases by focusing on large undergraduate lectures where students, 1, could not influence which instructors they got, 2, were anonymous to the professor, and 3, were graded by teaching assistants, not by the professors. All this points to biases that influence whom learners readily tune into and learn from. Our cultural learning biases are why role models matter so much. Older individuals often do know more. Both as an indirect measure of competence or experience, and as a measure of self-similarity, age cues may be important for cultural learning for 2 separate evolutionary reasons. For children, focusing on and learning from older children allows them to learn from more experienced individuals, while at the same time providing a means of self-scaffolding, allowing them to bridge gradually from less to more complex skills. The idea here is that although a learner may be able to locate and sometimes learn from the most successful or skilled person in his community, say the best hunter in a foraging band, many young learners will be too inexperienced or ill-equipped to take advantage of the nuances and fine points that distinguish the top hunters. Instead, by focusing on older children, young learners can isolate models who are operating at an appropriate increment of skill and complexity above their own. This creates a smoother and more continuous process of gradual skill acquisition as learners move back and forth from observing older models to practicing, and repeat the process as they grow up. This is why, for example, younger children are often so desperate to hang around their big cousins or older siblings, and why mixed-age playgroups are the standard in small-scale societies. Consistent with evolutionary expectations, young children do assess the age of potential models, perhaps by assessing physical size. Young children often prefer older models unless those individuals have proven unreliable. They trade off age against competence, and in some cases will prefer younger but more competent models to older, less competent ones. For example, in one experiment, second graders preferentially imitated the fruit choices of their fellow second graders over kindergarten models. However, when shown that some kindergartners and second graders were superior puzzle solvers, many second graders shifted to the fruit choices of these good puzzle solvers, even if they were sometimes kindergartners. In general, children and infants shift their food preferences in response to observing older, same-sex models enjoying certain foods. Even infants, as young as 14 months, are sensitive to age cues. At the other end of the age spectrum, merely getting to be old was a major accomplishment in the societies of our evolutionary past. By the time ancient hunter-gatherers reached 65, and some did, natural selection had already filtered many out of their cohort. This means that not only were the senior members of a community the most experienced, but also that they had emerged from decades of natural selection, acting selectively to shrink their age cohort. To see how this works, imagine you have a community with 100 people between the ages of 20 and 30. Of these 100, only 40 people routinely prepare their meat dishes using chili peppers. Suppose that using chili peppers, by virtue of their antimicrobial properties, suppresses foodborne pathogens and thereby reduces a person's chances of getting sick. If eating chili peppers year after year increases a person's chances of living past 65 from 10% to 20%, then a majority of this cohort, 57%, will be chili pepper eaters by the time they reach 65. If learners preferentially copy the older cohort instead of the younger cohort, they will have a greater chance of acquiring this survival-enhancing cultural trait. This is true even if they have no idea that chili peppers have any health impacts. Reference Chapter 7. Age-biased cultural learning here can thus amplify the action of natural selection as it creates differential mortality. Why care what others think? Conformist transmission. Suppose you are in a foreign city, hungry, and trying to pick one of 10 possible restaurants on a busy street. You can't read the menus because you don't know the local language, but you can tell that the prices and atmospheres of each establishment are identical. One place has 40 diners, 6 have 10 diners, and 3 are empty, except for the waitstaff. If you would pick the restaurant with 40 people out of the 100 you've observed, more than 40% of the time, then you are using conformist transmission. You are strongly inclined to copy the most common trait, the majority or the plurality. Evolutionary models, which are built to mathematically capture the logic of natural selection, predict that learners ought to use what's called conformist transmission to tackle a variety of learning problems. As long as individual learning, intuitions, direct experience, and other cultural learning mechanisms tend to produce adaptive practices, beliefs, and motivations, then conformist transmission can help learners aggregate the information that is distributed across a group. For example, suppose long experience fishing will tend to cause an experienced angler to prefer the blood knot to other potential knots for connecting monofilament line, because the blood knot is objectively the best. However, individual experiences will vary. So suppose that long experience alone leads to only a 50% chance of an angler converging on the blood knot, a 30% chance of using the fisherman's knot, and a 20% chance of using one of 5 other knots. A conformist learner can exploit this situation and jump directly to the blood knot without experience. Thus, the wisdom of crowds is built into our psychology. There is some laboratory evidence for conformist transmission, both in humans and sticklebacks, a fish, though there is not nearly as much as for the model-based cues discussed here. Nevertheless, when problems are difficult, uncertainty is high, or payoffs are on the line, people tend to use conformist transmission. Of course, we should expect learners to combine the learning heuristics I've described. For example, with regard to chili peppers, learners who apply conformist transmission to only the older cohort, sorting with age cues, will increase their chances of adopting this adaptive practice. If they are strong conformist learners, they will get the adaptive answer 100% of the time. Culturally transmitted suicide. You probably know that committing suicide is prestige biased. When celebrities commit suicide, there is a spike in suicide rates. Celebrities keep this in mind. This pattern has been observed in the United States, Germany, Australia, South Korea, and Japan, among other countries. Alongside prestige, the cultural transmission of suicide is also influenced by self-similarity cues. The individuals who kill themselves soon after celebrities tend to match their models on sex, age, and ethnicity. Moreover, it's not just that a celebrity suicide vaguely triggers the suicide of others. We know that people are imitating because they copy not only the act of suicide itself, but also the specific methods used, such as throwing oneself in front of a train. Moreover, most celebrity-induced copycat suicides are not tragedies that would have occurred anyway. If that were the case, there would be an eventual dip in suicide rates below the long-run average at some point after the spike, but there is not. These are extra suicides that otherwise would not have occurred. These effects can also be seen in suicide epidemics. Beginning in 1960, a striking pattern of suicide rippled through the Pacific islands of Micronesia for about 25 years. As the epidemic spread, the suicides assumed a distinct pattern. The typical victim was a young male between 15 and 24, modal age of 18, who still lived with his parents. After a disagreement with his parents or girlfriend, the victim experienced a vision in which past victims beckoned for him to come to them. We know this from attempted suicides. In heeding their call, the victim performed a lean hanging, sometimes in an abandoned house. In a lean hanging, victims lean into the noose from a standing or kneeling position. This gradually depletes the victim's supply of oxygen, resulting in a loss of consciousness and then death. These suicides occurred in localized and sporadic outbreaks among socially interconnected adolescents and young men, a pattern common elsewhere. Sometimes these epidemics could be traced to a particular spark, such as the suicide of a 29-year-old prominent son of a wealthy family. In 75% of the cases, there was no prior hint of suicide or depression. Interestingly, these epidemics were restricted to only two ethnic groups within Micronesia, the Truckese and Marshallese. Here we see that prestige and self-similarity, including both sex and ethnicity, shaped the diffusion of suicide. While most people don't copy suicide, this domain illustrates just how potent our cultural learning abilities can be and how they influence broad social patterns. If people will acquire suicidal behavior via cultural learning, it's not clear what the boundaries are on the power of culture in our species. Copying suicide highlights the potency of our imitative tendencies and means that under the right conditions, we can acquire practices via cultural learning that natural selection has directly acted to eliminate under most conditions. If humans will imitate something that is so starkly not in our self-interest, or that of our genes, imagine all the other less costly things we are willing to acquire by cultural transmission. In addition to using model-based mechanisms for cultural learning, we should also expect natural selection to have equipped us with psychological abilities and biases for learning about certain predictable content domains, such as food, fire, edible plants, animals, tools, social norms, ethnic groups, and reputations, gossip, which have probably been important over long stretches of our species' evolutionary history. Here, natural selection may have favored attention and interest in these domains, as well as inferential biases, leading to ready encoding in memory and greater learnability. In the coming chapters, we'll explore how culture-gene coevolution drove the emergence of some of these specialized cognitive abilities, or content biases, and examine key lines of supporting evidence. What's mentalizing for? If humans are a cultural species, then one of our most crucial adaptations is our ability to keenly observe and learn from other people. Central to our cultural learning is our ability to make inferences about the goals, preferences, motivations, intentions, beliefs, and strategies in the minds of others. These cognitive abilities relate to what is variously termed mentalizing or theory of mind. Any learners who miss the boat on mentalizing and cultural learning, or get started too late, will be at a serious disadvantage because they won't have acquired all the norms, skills, and know-how necessary to compete with other, better cultural learners. This logic suggests that the mental machinery we need for cultural learning ought to fire up relatively early in our development. It's this mental machinery that we will rely on to figure out what to eat, how to communicate, whom to avoid, how to behave, which skills to practice, and much more. Evidence from young children and infants in Western populations, combined with recent cross-cultural work in Fiji, Amazonia, and China, suggests that these mentalizing abilities begin to develop early and reliably across diverse human societies. By the age of roughly 8 months, infants in at least some societies have developed an ability to infer intentions and goals, and to recognize who likely has knowledge and who does not. Infants, for example, will copy a model's goals or intentions, such as grasping a toy, even when the model fails to achieve his goal. But they won't copy unintentional actions that create the same physical results. By the time they are toddling, children are already making sophisticated judgments about others' mental states. For example, recognizing that a potential model mislabeled a familiar object and then subsequently devaluing what that model has to say. Similarly, toddlers can figure out what aspects of context are new for their model and use this to better target their learning, even when those same aspects are familiar to the learner. Though they agree mentalizing is important, many evolutionary researchers argue that these cognitive abilities evolved genetically in our lineage, so we can better trick, manipulate, and deceive other members of our group. This is part of the Machiavellian intelligence hypothesis. The idea is that if Robin can infer Mike's goals, motivations, or beliefs, then Robin can exploit or manipulate Mike. He can outthink him and then outmaneuver him. However, another possibility is that mentalizing first evolved in our lineage, or perhaps was retasked away from trickery, deception, and manipulation, so that we could better learn from others by more effectively inferring our model's underlying goals, strategies, and preferences for the purpose of copying them. Mentalizing also may help us teach more effectively, since good teaching requires us to assess what learners need to know. These expectations flow from the cultural intelligence hypothesis. In my psychology laboratory at UBC, our team has sought to allow these two hypotheses to face off against each other. In a novel situation, we gave young children the opportunity to deploy their mentalizing abilities, either to copy the strategies of others or to exploit a hapless opponent. The results are stark. Children strongly favor cultural learning over Machiavellian exploitation, even when their payoffs and personal experience point them away from copying others. Of course, this doesn't mean that mentalizing isn't also deployed for social strategizing, as it clearly is in chimpanzees. But what it does imply is that in humans you first need to acquire the social norms and rules governing the world you are operating in, and only then is strategic thinking useful. In our world, even successful Machiavellians must first be skilled cultural learners. You can't bend, exploit, and manipulate the rules until you first figure out what the rules are. Learning to learn and to teach. The evidence from infants and young children now suggests that humans rapidly develop a heavy reliance on carefully attending to and learning from other people, often using their mentalizing skills, and that they readily begin using cues such as success and prestige to figure out whom to learn from. However, it seems likely that both our degree of reliance on cultural learning over our own experience or innate intuitions, as well as how heavily we weight cues of prestige or gender vis-a-vis other cues, may be itself tuned by both our own direct experience and our observations of others. That is, we need to be able to calibrate these systems for the contexts we encounter in the world. The importance of both direct experience and the observation of others is particularly clear for developing teaching abilities. Teaching is the flip side of cultural learning. It occurs when the model becomes an active transmitter of information. Later, I'll discuss some evidence that suggests natural selection has operated to improve our transmission or communicative abilities, especially since the evolution of languages. Nevertheless, most people are still not particularly great teachers, especially of complex tasks, concepts, or skills, so cultural evolution has produced a wide range of strategies and techniques adapted for more effectively transmitting particular types of content, such as judo, algebra, or cooking. This is one way cultural transmission increases its own fidelity. Learners acquire both the skills themselves as well as techniques for transmitting them. In the early days, when our species was just beginning to rely on cultural learning, as cultural evolution was cranking up, it may be that attending to and copying others was acquired by experience, perhaps through trial and error learning, because it tended to get the best answer compared to other learning strategies. Consistent with this idea, apes reared by humans, sometimes in human families, seem to be better at imitation compared to other apes. Importantly, however, Though they improve relative to chimpanzees not reared by humans, they still pale in comparison to human children reared in the identical environments for the same time periods. Such evidence suggests that cultural learning may have initially developed as a response to the enriched environments created by the very earliest accumulations of cultural evolution. Reference chapter 16. This learned increase in cultural learning would have permitted a greater accumulation of cultural know-how and further driven genetic evolution to make us better cultural learners. Now, the vast differences we observe between apes and human infants raised in the same environments suggests that the emergence of cultural learning is relatively canalized and rapid in our species, though, of course, it can still be modified by experience.